endocrine system by looking at some of the other endocrine glands along besides the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Starting with the thyroid. It's a butterfly-shaped gland in the front of the neck on the trachea, just below the larynx. It's made up of a middle piece called the isthmus, which is the connecting of the two lobes, and within the thyroid there are follicles. Those are hollow spheres of epithelial follicular cells producing a glycoprotein called thyroglobulin. The colloid is the fluid of the follicle lumen, has thyroglobulin plus iodine. It's a precursor to the thyroid hormone. And surrounding those cells are parafollicular cells that are producing the hormone calcitonin. So here is your isthmus. These are the sides, and within those there are the follicles. And these are the follicles which you'll be looking at in the lab. Parafollicular cells kind of between them. So the body's major metabolic hormone is thyroid hormone. There are actually two forms of thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, which differ in the number of iodines that are attached to them. T4 is the most potent form, and most of the time T3 is converted to T4 to make it a higher affinity at the periphery. So they are iodine-containing amine hormones. Thyroid hormone affects virtually every body cell. It enters target cells through and binds to intracellular receptors within the nucleus, and that triggers transcription of metabolic genes. So the effect of thyroid hormones will include an increased basal metabolic rate, heat production. This is often referred to as the calorogenic effect. It regulates tissue growth and development. It is critical for normal skeletal and nervous system development and reproductive capabilities. And it's also very important for maintaining blood pressure. It increases the adrenergic receptors in blood vessels. So thyroid hormone is synthesized in rather a convoluted manner. The thyroid gland stores the hormone extracellularly in the follicular lumen until triggered by thyroid stimulating hormone to release it. And there are 7 steps involved in the synthesis of thyroid hormone. First, thyroglobulin is synthesized and discharged into the lumen of the follicle, so those purple colored areas. Then iodide is trapped, so iodide ions are actively taken into the cell and then transcytosed and released into the lumen where the thyroid hormone is, or where thyroglobulin is waiting. The iodine is then oxidized, which means that electrons are removed and it is converted to iodine. That iodine is going to be attached to tyrosine, one of the 20 amino acids, and that's mediated by a peroxidase enzyme. So if only one iodine is attached, it's called monoiodotyrosine, or MIT. If 2 are attached, it's diiodotyrosine, or DIT. And then those iodinated tyrosines are going to link together to form either T3 or T4. So if one MIT and one DIT are linked together, you get T3. If 2 DITs are linked together, you get T4. At that point, the colloid is then endocytosed by follicular cells. The vesicles combine with a lysosome. The lysosomal enzymes cleave T3 and T4 from the thyroglobulin, and the hormones are secreted into the bloodstream. Mostly T4 secreted, but also some T3. And at the tissue level, T3 must be converted to T4. So it starts in the cell. The cell produces thyroglobulin and sends it to the follicular cells, that's here. And then iodine is captured on the luminal side of the follicular cell, transcytosed into the follicle. Then the iodine is oxidized, and the attached to tyrosines in the colloid, forming DIT and MIT. Those are internalized again by the cell and make their way through transcytosis, where they are broken down into T3 and T4, which are released into the blood. T3 and T4 are transported by thyroxine-binding globulins, TBGs. Both bind target receptors, but T3 is 10 times more active than T4. So in the periphery, tissues have an enzyme that converts T4 to T3, which an enzyme that removes one iodine from the molecule. Thyroid hormone release is regulated by negative feedback, so falling thyroid hormone levels will stimulate the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone. Rising thyroid hormone levels provide negative feedback, so they inhibit TSH. And TSH can also be inhibited by growth hormone inhibiting factor, dopamine, or an increased level of cortisol and iodine. Hypothalamic thyrotropic releasing hormone can override the negative feedback during pregnancy or exposure to cold, especially in infants. So figure 16.7 summarizes that for you. And 16.4 table gives you a lot of the information about the controls and effects of thyroid hormone. Homeostatic imbalances, hyposecretion of thyroid hormone in adults leads to something called myxedema. Symptoms would include low metabolic rate, thick and or dry skin, puffy eyes, feeling chilled, constipation, edema, mental sluggishness, lethargy. If it's due to a lack of iodine, a goiter could develop. Lack of iodine decreases thyroid hormone levels, which triggers increased thyroid stimulating hormone secretion, and that synthesizes unusable thyroglobulin and causes the thyroid to enlarge. Thyroid hormone is critical for normal growth and brain development in early childhood. Congenital hypothyroidism is usually caused by a poor development of the thyroid gland, but it could be pituitary problems. Maternal medications sometimes affect the baby's ability to make thyroid hormone. Maybe asymptomatic or present with weak cry, poor feeding, constipation, prolonged jaundice. But in this case, thyroid hormone replacement is crucial, and it usually has to go lifelong. So here is a goiter. Hypersecretion of thyroid hormone is something called Graves' disease. Usually it's caused by Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disease, and the body makes antibodies that are directed against thyroid follicular cells. Those antibodies mimic TSH, so they cause thyroid hormone to be released. Here the symptoms would include an elevated metabolic rate, sweating, rapid irregular heartbeats, nervousness, weight loss despite adequate food. One of the key features of this is something called exophthalmos, which the eyes protrude as the tissue behind the eyes becomes edematous and fibrous. And that's this next image. Oh no, we'll get the image in a minute. So treatment for this would include the surgical removal of part of the thyroid or radioactive iodine that destroys the active thyroid cells. Here's exophthalmos. Calcitonin is the other hormone. It's produced by parafollicular cells in response to high levels of calcium in the blood. It is an antagonist to parathyroid hormone, but it really doesn't have a known physiological role in humans because at normal physiological levels. But if it comes up at higher than normal doses, it can inhibit osteoclast activity and prevent the release of calcium from bone matrix and stimulates calcium uptake and incorporation into the bone matrix. So physiological levels don't seem to do much. So again, the thyroid gland, the follicles, parafollicular cells, and the follicular cells. So the parathyroid gland we talked about is 4 to 8 teeny yellow-brown glands that are embedded in the back of the thyroid. They contain cells called oxaphyll cells, whose function is not clear, parathyroid cells that secrete parathyroid hormone, or also known as parathormone. PTH is the most important hormone in calcium homeostasis, secreted in response to low levels of calcium and inhibited by rising levels of calcium. It targets the skeleton, the kidneys, and the intestines. So there are those parathyroid glands. It stimulates osteoclasts to digest bone matrix and release calcium to the blood. It enhances the reabsorption of calcium and secretion of phosphate by the kidneys. It promotes activation of vitamin D by the kidneys, and that leads to an increased absorption of calcium by intestinal mucosa. And here they are lined out for you. 1612. Hyperparathyroidism can be due to a parathyroid gland tumor. Calcium leaches from the bones, causing them to soften and deform. Elevated calcium depresses the nervous system, contributes to the formation of kidney stones, and there is something called osteitis fibrosa cystia, which is a severe form resulting in easily fractured bones. Hypoparathyroidism would be due to trauma to the gland or removal by surgical means. That can cause hypocalcemia. That can result in tetany, respiratory paralysis, and eventually death. The adrenal gland is a pair of pyramid-shaped organs that sit on top of the kidneys, so they are also referred to as the suprarenal glands. Structurally and functionally, it's really two glands in one, the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is the 3 layers of glandular tissues that synthesize and secrete several different hormones we talked about, while the medulla is nervous tissue, part of the sympathetic nervous system. So the cortex is divided into 3 zones, and those 3 zones secrete up to 24 different hormones that are collectively called corticosteroids. They are steroid hormones, and they are not stored in the cells. Their release rate is going to depend on how quickly they are synthesized. So the 3 layers of the cortex are the zona glomerulosa, vasculitis, and reticulitis, and each one of those produces different corticosteroids. The outermost is mineral corticosteroids, and they're involved in ion levels in the blood. Glucocorticoids are produced by the middle layer, and they're involved in the regulation of metabolism, glucose use. And then the innermost layer produces the gonatocorticoids, which are similar to gonadal hormones. The mineral corticoids regulate electrolyte concentrations, mostly sodium and potassium, in the extracellular fluid. The importance of sodium is that it has a major effect on extracellular volume, which we will get to in the coming days, coming weeks of the chapter of the book, which will have an effect on blood volume, blood pressure, levels of other ions as well. Potassium sets the resting membrane potential of most cells. Aldosterone is the most potent of these mineral corticoids. It stimulates sodium reabsorption in the kidneys and results in increased blood volume and pressure. It also stimulates potassium release by the kidneys. Effects of aldosterone are short-lived, but it does stimulate the synthesis and activation of a sodium-potassium ATPase transport pump, and that pump exchanges sodium for potassium. Things that regulate aldosterone secretion include the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, plasma concentrations of potassium, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, produced by the heart. That renin-angiotensin-aldosterone decreases blood pressure and stimulates special cells in the kidneys. Those cells release renin into the blood. That renin is then broken into pieces, one of which is the angiotensinogen that triggers an enzyme cascade, and angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is a potent stimulator for aldosterone release. Plasma concentrations of potassium, an increased potassium directly influences the zona glomerulosa cells to release aldosterone. Increased potassium directly stimulates aldosterone release, low levels inhibit it. ACTH can cause a small increase in aldosterone during periods of stress, and AMP produced by the heart is in response to high blood pressure, blocks renin and aldosterone secretions to decrease blood pressure. So here those mechanisms are outlined in figure 16.14, and I would encourage you to look them over closely. Aldosteronism is a hypersecretion, usually due to adrenal tumors, which can result in hypertension and edema due to excess sodium, and excretion of potassium that can lead to abnormal, non-responsive neurons and muscles. And, glucocorticoids influence metabolism of most cells and help us resist stressors. They keep blood glucose levels relatively constant, maintain blood pressure by increasing the action of vasoconstrictors. Glucocorticoid hormones include cortisol, cortisone, and corticosterone. Cortisol is also called hydrocortisone. That's the one that is in significant amounts and gets all the press. It's regulated in response to ACTH. ACTH released in response to corticotropic releasing hormone. Corticotropic releasing hormones released in response to low cortisol levels. Increased cortisol levels should inhibit ACTH and CRH through negative feedback. Cortical secretion cycles are governed by patterns of eating and activity. Acute stress interrupts the cortisol system, and the central nervous system can also override cortisol inhibition of ACTH and CRH that leads to more cortisol secretion. Cortisol causes an increase in blood levels of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. Its prime metabolic effect is gluconeogenesis, or the formation of glucose from fats and proteins. It encourages cells to use fatty acids for fuel, so glucose is saved for the brain. Other function will enhance vasoconstriction, so it can cause rises in blood pressure, and that's thought to help quickly distribute nutrients to cells. Excessive levels of glucocorticoids depress cartilage and bone formation, inhibit inflammation by decreasing inflammatory chemicals, depress the immune system, disrupt normal cardiovascular, neural, and gastrointestinal functions. Glucocorticoid drugs can control symptoms of many inflammatory diseases, arthritis, and allergies, but they also have undesirable effects. Hypersecretion leads to Cushing's syndrome or Cushing's disease. Cut. Hey, that time, is it?